My name is Major General Richard Harlan, age 68, and this is the story of the day my daughter decided I was worth less than her vacation. For most of my life, I wore the weight of my rank like a second skin, a skin made of medals, scars, and the silent burdens only those who command men into danger will ever know. I had seen the worst of human nature across continents and battlefields, had watched men rise and fall under the banner of duty, and I believed, foolishly perhaps, that my own blood would honor the man who fought so hard to carve out their future. That illusion shattered on the morning of my 68th birthday. It was supposed to be a celebration, a gathering in my home, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and the warmth of family. I woke early, still peeping military hours, and ironed the shirt I'd chosen days before. The medals on my chest gleamed in the weak sunlight. The table was set for 12, each place meticulously arranged, every glass sparkling with expectation. I even made the coffee strong, the way my daughter Anna used to like it when she was in high school, before life and distance hardened the softness I once saw in her eyes. By noon, the house was silent. Not silent in the peaceful way a house rests before a party, but hollow in absence that rang louder than any artillery shell. My phone sat face up on the table, vibrating with the ghostly pulse of digital reminders. Birthday lunch, 1 p.m. I watched the clock hands crawl over the hour, refusing to give in to the growing dread in my gut. At 1:13 p.m., a single message arrived, shattering the illusion of hope I'd tried to keep alive. It wasn't even from Anna herself. It came from her husband's number, as if I'd become too much of an inconvenience for direct contact. Dad, we talked as a family. We think it's best you spend some time at Willow Haven Assisted Living. It's nicer for you. There's a note for you at the front desk. Happy birthday. I read the words twice, then a third time, waiting for a punchline, a call, a voice, anything that would make it a joke. Instead, the doorbell rang. 2 men in pressed Palos staff from the facility stood on my porch with polite smiles and an envelope. They did not look me in the eyes as they explained that my room was ready, that Anna had handled everything, that it was all for my comfort. I could hear, in the pauses between their rehearsed sentences, the truth. I was being shipped away like an old trunk gathering dust in the attic. The only thing heavier than the medals on my chest was the sense of betrayal settling in my bones. I packed a single bag, left the house with my head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me buckle. At Willow Haven, the manager handed me Anna's letter. Her handwriting, once looped and childish, was now sharp and businesslike. Dad, I hope you understand. It's better for you here, just for a while. We all think you need to rest. No signature, no love you, just a line at the bottom. We're headed to Miami with Margaret's family. I'll call when we're back. The reality set in as I sat on the stiff bed in that unfamiliar room, surrounded by floral curtains and the distant hum of other forgotten parents. I checked social media, because even when your family abandons you, they can't resist a photo op. There she was, Anna, my only child, sunning herself on a yacht, arm in arm with Margaret, her mother-in-law, and smiling for a camera that would never capture what she'd left behind. A caption under the photo, "Family is everything." The words burned deeper than any wound I'd ever received. I scrolled, seeing the faces of my grandchildren, their smiles bright and oblivious, celebrating the trip of a lifetime, while the man who'd built that life sat exiled, not even given the dignity of an explanation. I replayed the moments that led here, the late nights waiting for Anna to come home from parties, the time I mortgaged the house to pay for her college when she lost her scholarship, the quiet pride I felt every time I saw her succeed. And this was my reward, a note, a one-way ticket to irrelevance, and a family cruise without the one man who never missed a roll call. I sat in that room for hours, replaying the message, the letter, the photos, letting the humiliation settle until it grew cold and sharp. Something inside me shifted. The scars that lined my soul from years of service flared again, not as pain, but as clarity. I would not let this be my legacy. If Anna wanted to treat me like I was expendable, she was about to learn exactly how costly it was to betray a man who had commanded armies. Forgiveness, I decided, was off the table. The rest of the story would be written in strategy, not sentiment. The morning after my so-called birthday, the world outside Willow Haven glowed in soft gold, but I felt none of its warmth. The ache in my chest had cooled overnight into something else resolve, cold and orderly, the kind that used to steady my hand before battle. Major General Richard Harlan does not beg for love. He does not allow himself to be erased. He acts at 6 a.m. While the other residents were just stirring, I opened my laptop, a battered old machine I kept out of habit more than need. My credentials still opened every door I required. A lifetime of service coded into the back ends of banks, pension offices, and military foundations. Anna had long relied on my accounts, just as she'd relied on my patience and pride. She had always been the first to call when the mortgage was late, when her car broke down, when my grandchildren needed tuition or trips or new shoes. Each request had been granted without a word. That, I now realized, was my mistake. I logged in, one by one, to every portal and dashboard. It was almost too easy. The checking account frozen, the secondary savings locked. The credit cards, every last one, from platinum to gas station rewards, suspended. I removed her name and her husband's from every shared asset. I revoked the authorized user privileges on the medical plans. I even shut down the streaming services and phone plans that she'd quietly bundled under my name for years. For the first time since my wife's passing, my financial world was mine alone. I wrote a single message and sent it to Anna's phone, knowing it would wake her on Miami's sun-drenched coast. The tone was clipped, precise, the way I'd drafted orders for soldiers in the field. Anna, effective immediately. All cards, accounts, and benefits you accessed in my name are suspended. It is time you learn the value of every cent you spend. This is not a request. It is a command. Dad, I left nothing more. There was nothing left to say. As the day unfolded, I imagined the dominoes falling. Anna would try to pay for lunch at some breezy beachfront restaurant, and her card would be declined. She would frown, blame the machine, try another, and get the same result. Calls would begin, first with annoyance, then with mounting panic voicemails stacking up unanswered, texts growing sharper, more frantic. She would check her apps, see balances at zero, and realize the lifeline she'd so carelessly severed had been yanked away with military precision. Margaret, the new mother-in-law, would surely notice the sudden belt tightening. The awkward silences as Anna scrambled to explain why their luxury suite needed a new credit card, why tickets couldn't be upgraded, why nothing in her life worked as easily as before. I could almost hear Anna's voice, brittle and desperate, echoing through the sterile halls of her hotel. But I felt no satisfaction, only the cold certainty of justice delivered. In the quiet of my small room, I watched the sun crawl higher, casting long, clean lines across the floor. For the first time since I'd been dropped here like excess baggage, I felt the balance of power tilt. I was not helpless. I was not obsolete. The world that Anna had built atop my sacrifices would begin to crumble, one transaction at a time, until she understood, until they all understood, that even in exile, I could still command outcomes. Even in humiliation, I could still shape destiny. I turned off my phone, ignored the vibrating flood of notifications, and poured myself a mug of bitter coffee from the shared kitchenette. Around me, the gentle routines of Willow Haven continued, oblivious to the small war I'd begun. The nurses smiled politely, their faces a mask of professional concern. But I no longer felt seen as a patient. In the space between rage and resolve, I'd found my old self, the man who didn't flinch, who didn't forgive, who acted decisively when crossed. Outside, a bird landed on the iron railing, tilting its head as if to ask what came next. I almost smiled. There was plenty more to come. I had learned long ago that war is won not by a single blow, but by a campaign methodical, relentless, unyielding. Anna would remember this lesson long after the sunburns of Miami faded. So would everyone else who had quietly enjoyed the fruits of my labors while plotting my disappearance. I sipped my coffee, staring into the morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The games were over. The campaign had only just begun. It took less than 48 hours for my daughter to realize what real consequence felt like. I watched the missed calls pile up, a barrage of pleading messages, her voice morphing from annoyed to frantic, then finally to angry and accusatory, as if I owed her comfort for the discomfort I'd delivered. I responded to none. Instead, I scheduled an appointment with my attorney, a man who had been by my side since my earliest years of command, who still addressed me as General out of respect, not habit. When I explained, in clipped phrases, the circumstances of my family vacation in Willow Haven, he simply nodded, his eyes sharpening with the kind of understanding only old soldiers know. On the afternoon of my third day in that antiseptic prison, I left in a borrowed car, my badge of rank gleaming under my civilian jacket. The drive downtown was silent. I rehearsed every step of the next maneuver. No hesitation, no regret. The law office was cool and spare, its windows catching the muted sunlight of a city that didn't care whether a man like me disappeared or was celebrated. In a conference room with dark walnut walls, I spread the old will before us. The document was thick, littered with decades of careful revisions and inherited hopes. My wife's handwriting still lingered in the margins from the days we dreamed together of a long, dignified legacy. But dignity was not what Anna and her conspirators had given me. They had offered me a slow erasure. That I would answer with erasure of my own. With my attorney's help, I struck through the names of every person who had left me to rot in Willow Haven. Anna, her husband, my grandchildren, each one a bright spot I had hoped to protect, but who had learned too quickly to look away. Margaret, the new mother-in-law, who had become a shadowy presence in every financial meeting and family dinner. All of them vanished with the stroke of a pen. Instead, I named the Veterans Care Trust as the primary beneficiary of my estate millions in assets, property and bonds, all redirected to men and women who would never leave a comrade behind. I appointed my oldest living friend, Colonel Harold Stokes, as executor. Stokes and I had crawled through hell together in Southeast Asia and buried friends on foreign soil. He'd never wavered, not once, not when bullets flew, not when time eroded the easy confidence of youth. I trusted him as I trusted no one else. My lawyer asked if I wished to leave any token inheritance, some scrap to Anna and the rest, a last chance at reconciliation. I looked him in the eye, the same way I'd looked at subordinates before sending them into fire. They left me to die in that place, I said quietly. They inherit nothing but the memory of what they gave up. With every signature, every notarized page, I felt the old numbness in my chest recede. I was not a victim. I was a commander again, decisive, unsentimental, immune to pleading. It was not revenge I sought, but justice, a realignment of loyalty, of honor, of legacy. I would not reward betrayal with bounty, nor cowardice with comfort. My legacy would go to those who understood sacrifice, not those who only recognized convenience. Before leaving, I made one last request. A copy of the New Testament, delivered to my private safe and to Stokes, with explicit instructions that not a word of its contents be shared until my death. Anna would find out eventually, too late to fix the damage, too late to shed crocodile tears at my bedside. She would learn, as all traitors do, that trust is a currency spent only once. As I drove back to Willow Haven, the city looked different, clearer, sharper. My world had shrunk, but my will, my dignity, had only grown. They had abandoned me, but I would ensure my name, my honor, my hard-earned wealth would outlast every one of their calculated betrayals. That night, alone in my small, sterile room, I slept soundly for the first time since the day I was dropped like unwanted luggage at that gate. I had started the process of erasing them from my future, just as they tried to erase me from their present. and it felt, finally, like the beginning of victory. By the end of that week, I had become adept at watching people's true nature surface when they believed no one was observing. Anna still had not called me directly, but her husband left a voicemail equal parts indignation and veiled threat, as if he believed his role as a father and provider, purchased with my money, entitled him to something more. But I was not interested in their tantrums or their rationalizations. My mind was fixed on the woman whose presence had become a shadow in my household, the so-called new mother-in-law, Margaret Parker. Margaret was the kind of woman who moved through life with calculated charm and an eye for opportunity. I had long suspected her involvement in Anna's changing attitude, subtle manipulations, sly encouragements to think of your own future, whispers that an old man's estate should serve the living, not the past. She had spent years cultivating a reputation as a charitable woman, active in community circles and always ready to give advice at the country club, but I had seen behind the mask. Margaret's ambitions were personal, and her hands, for all their white gloves, were far from clean. I called in a favor, reaching out to a contact in military intelligence, whose discretion was as legendary as his effectiveness. A few encrypted emails and background checks later, I had a dossier thick enough to make any lawyer salivate. The evidence was not circumstantial. Margaret had a trail of irregularities going back a decade. Shell companies in her maiden name, unexplained deposits from consulting gigs that never quite added up, a rental property she had listed as vacant while pocketing cash from unreported tenants. But the most damning were the falsified receipts she had submitted to a local charity, money meant for wounded veterans that found its way into her own investments. It would have been easy to leak this to the press and watch the scandal unfold, but I preferred something more precise, more devastating. I compiled the evidence into a meticulous report, highlighting every infraction, every illegal transfer, every lie she had whispered into the city's ear. The package went out in a thick, unmarked envelope to the county tax board, to the charity's main office, and most importantly, to the IRS. There was no note, no signature, just cold, undeniable facts. Margaret's world, built on deception, was about to collapse from within. I watched the news from my room at Willow Haven as the first ripples hit. A local charity abruptly announced an audit. Margaret resigned from 2 committees for personal reasons. The rumor mill exploded. Old friends stopped calling. Even Anna's social feeds, once a steady stream of yacht photos and dinner parties, fell silent. They would be too busy meeting with attorneys to stage any more photo ops. I never spoke a word of this to Anna. She would find out soon enough, and when she did, I wanted her to understand. This was not revenge. It was a lesson in consequences. For every kindness betrayed, there would be an accounting. For every time they tried to write me off as a frail, out-of-touch old man, I would remind them of the force that had once moved armies and shaped destinies. I had not just stripped Anna of her inheritance. I had brought down the scaffolding that propped up her new alliances. Margaret Parker would soon have far bigger worries than spa appointments or cruise tickets. And Anna, too, would be forced to reckon with the truth that no fortress built on lies could stand long, under the scrutiny of a man who knew how to fight for what was rightfully his. I returned to my routine at the home with a subtle, unspoken satisfaction. The chessboard had changed again, and with every quiet, decisive move, I was reclaiming not only my dignity, but the narrative of my own life. They would come to see that betrayal was not a private wound, it was a public reckoning, and I was not finished yet. The fallout from Margaret's unraveling had only just begun to seep into the town's gossip veins when I enacted the next phase. I had always been a man of protocol, precise and methodical, never lashing out in anger, but striking only when the result was certain and the blow undeniable. My humiliation had already made its quiet rounds among Anna's circle, whispered in kitchens and club lounges. "Did you hear at the General?" Left in that place while they vacationed with the new family. How could she? But hearsay wasn't enough. I needed the lesson to be carved into memory, not just traded as rumor. That week, I contacted the local newspaper's editorial desk, signing the letter simply as a veteran. I composed my words with care, every sentence measured, every omission intentional. I did not mention names, nor did I seek pity. Instead, I wrote about what it meant to serve, to build, to sacrifice. I spoke of the pain many veterans feel in silence, of giving decades to a country or a family only to find themselves unwanted when their hands are no longer steady, their steps no longer swift. I wrote, "Ingratitude is the silent betrayal that eats away not only at a man's dignity, but at the fabric of the very society that raised him." I detailed, with subtlety but precision, the loneliness of milestone birthdays spent in rooms that echoed with absence, the ache of watching one's children trade legacy for convenience, and the shame that only grows when you realize your name means more to strangers than to your own kin. I praised the ones who remembered their elders, who sat quietly and listened, who visited and honored, who understood that the medals on an old man's chest were earned with blood, not bought at a costume shop. I made it clear, without ever resorting to anger or accusation, that abandonment is not just a family's failure, it's a failure of character, and it never goes unseen by those who built the world before you. When the letter ran that Sunday, nestled among town hall updates and charity drive reminders, it caused a ripple that traveled far beyond what any social post could accomplish. I watched from Willow Haven as the phones in the staff room lit up, neighbors calling, some out of shame, others out of belated concern. The staff congratulated me quietly, understanding what I had chosen not to say outright. Even the administrator, a woman with years of weathered patience, slipped a note under my door. "You made us all proud. Thank you for speaking for those who can't." But the true effect unfolded in the subtle shifts around town. Anna's friends began to ask more pointed questions, their invitations slower, their smiles stiffer. Margaret's name came up in less and less favorable conversations, her former allies crossing the street rather than greet her. Some strangers even reached out to the home, volunteering to visit the forgotten veterans, as the story had begun to circulate. The narrative was changing not just for me, but for every man and woman in Willow Haven who had ever looked at the door, hoping for family and receiving only silence. I had not sought vengeance for its own sake. I wanted my daughter, and anyone else who ever dared to treat the men who built their foundations as disposable, to understand public shame is a mirror. When the world looks in, it remembers who stood strong and who turned away. I did not have to shout. My silence amplified through the written word and the quiet support of a grateful townsfolk with more authority than any accusation. Anna, for the first time in her life, would see what it meant to be on the outside looking in, and I was not finished. There was more to come, and with each step, I reclaimed a piece of myself that they believed would fade into loneliness. But I had never been more alive. The week after my letter was published, something in the air shifted, not just in town, but in Willow Haven itself. The staff, who once moved briskly through their routines, now paused at my door with questions about my service, their words tinged with genuine respect. Other residents, many of them veterans in their own right, began to treat me with a new kind of camaraderie, one born from the knowledge that my pain was shared and my resolve contagious. But for all the support from strangers, the wound from Anna's betrayal remained raw. That was when I decided my next move would not simply reclaim my pride, but remind everyone, especially my daughter, exactly who I was and who still stood beside me. On a chilly Saturday morning, as the frost clung to the hedges outside and the sun glinted off the brass plaque near the front door, I sent a brief message to my old executive officer. I had always kept in touch with a handful of close friends from my years in uniform, men and women who had bled beside me on distant continents and never needed to ask twice if I required their help. The message was simple: it's time. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. Within hours, the plan was set in motion. The following Friday, Willow Haven was uncharacteristically lively. Word had spread among staff and residents that something was afoot. I was up early, uniform pressed and medals polished, each detail a deliberate statement. The click of my shoes echoed through the hallway as I made my way to the lobby. At precisely 10 a.m., the sound of engines rolling up the long driveway grew louder, and outside, a line of vehicles appeared, each one marked with the insignia of various branches of the armed forces, each one carrying men and women who had stood in parade formations and battlefield trenches with me decades earlier. As the doors to the home opened, veterans stepped out in full dress, forming an honor guard along the walkway. The town's local news station had caught wind of the spectacle and arrived just in time to capture it live. Nurses, orderlies, and a handful of residents gathered at the windows, drawn by the commotion. When I stepped outside, flanked by my friends, some older, some still sharp-eyed, and broad-shouldered, a hush fell over the crowd. Every salute was sharp. Every handshake was firm. A bugler played "America the Beautiful" as we made our way down the steps, and I felt, for the first time since Anna's abandonment, the full weight and dignity of my past rise to meet me. The procession moved not to a hospital or another facility, but directly back to my own house, which I had never sold, despite my daughter's suggestions to downsize for comfort. The flag was raised high on the front lawn. My friends filed inside, filling the place with laughter, war stories, and the familiar sense of belonging that Anna had failed to provide. Neighbors came by, some out of curiosity, some to offer warm bread or simply pay their respects. Even the mayor stopped in, offering a handshake and a nod that said more than any speech ever could. For Anna, watching from afar as photos and videos flooded social media and the local news, it was a public reckoning. She had left me behind, but I had been lifted up not by obligation or blood, but by choice and brotherhood. For every moment she tried to erase me, my comrades restored what mattered most: respect, honor, and the knowledge that true family stands with you, not when it is easy, but when it is necessary. My rescue was not merely a return to comfort, but a declaration to Anna and the entire community that my story and my worth would never be written by those who chose to forget. As evening set in and my house hummed with the quiet dignity of old warriors, I sat at my desk, pen in hand, drafting the next step in a campaign of consequences Anna had never imagined. The first act of abandonment had set everything in motion, but from now on, every act would belong to me. And I was just getting started. It didn't take long for the shockwaves of my homecoming to reverberate through the world. Anna and her new circle thought was untouchable. My return, escorted by the proud ranks of veterans and splashed across every social feed in our town, forced people to ask uncomfortable questions. How could a daughter, so outwardly polished and ambitious, abandon her own father, a decorated major general, in a place meant for the forgotten, while she sipped champagne with a stranger's family in Miami? Whispers turned to conversations, and conversations quickly became open judgments. Yet what they saw was only the beginning. Within days, Anna and her mother-in-law, so recently parading their vacation photos and expensive tastes, found themselves facing a very different reality. The first blow was financial. Every account, card, and privilege they'd leaned on for my years of discipline and sacrifice now coldly closed. Anna called my lawyer in a panic, only to discover that my instructions were absolute and irreversible. No more trust funds, no emergency bailouts, no access to the safe deposit box or investment accounts. The house she lived in, titled in my name, was no longer a guarantee. My lawyer delivered the message with the same crisp precision I demanded of my officers. You are now on your own. Adjust accordingly. But it was the next blow, strategic, silent, and devastating, that shattered Anna's social armor. I had always played the long game. Quietly, methodically, I had collected documents, emails, and receipts that outlined years of indulgence, and in her new mother-in-law's case, outright tax fraud. It was a matter of hours for my contacts in federal and state offices to put together anonymous tip-offs, and even less time before the first letter from the Revenue Service landed in her mailbox. The new matriarch, of Anna's borrowed world found herself the subject of a rapidly growing investigation. Her business frozen, her social reputation now a matter of gossip and dread. Friends who had once flocked to Anna's parties, eager for connections and privileges, slowly began to vanish. Invitations dried up. Private group chats filled with apologies and shallow attempts to distance themselves from the growing scandal. The reality was simple. My daughter had built her new life on borrowed time and borrowed wealth. Without my protection, it was a matter of days before she and her new family were forced to face the world for what they truly were: petty, dependent, and desperately alone. Anna's attempts at damage control failed to inspire the sympathy she expected. No matter how she tried to reframe the story an overworked daughter, a misunderstood act of tough love, the evidence and the optics made her look not like a victim, but a fraud. In her desperation, she even tried to reach out to mutual friends and respected members of the community, hoping for allies. What she didn't realize was that these were the same people who had seen the parade of uniforms escort me home. The same people who watched veterans in wheelchairs and on canes salute with trembling hands as I returned to the place I'd built, brick by brick, not just with money, but with a lifetime of service. Every day brought new headlines, local blogs, and even a state paper picked up the story. General abandoned. The community responds. Photos of me, flanked by men and women in uniform, contrasted sharply with shots of Anna and her mother-in-law, faces blurred behind tinted sunglasses and hastily shut doors. The final blow to Anna's world was not delivered in anger, but with the cold, deliberate discipline that had carried me through war and peace. I was not just teaching my daughter the cost of betrayal, I was letting her taste the bitter flavor of consequences. And as she began to realize that the old man she dismissed had not faded away, but risen, she was forced to reckon with the truth. Respect, once lost, can never be bought back. The weeks that followed made clear to Anna and her new family just how completely the world could shift when you mistake kindness for weakness. As the rumors of her abandonment and the financial scandal deepened, invitations to charity events and social functions evaporated. For years, she had relished being photographed beside me, basking in the borrowed glow of my medals and handshake agreements. Now, those same circles looked right through her, their conversations stopping mid-sentence when she entered a room. But I was far from finished. I had one last lesson to orchestrate, this one public, grand, and unforgettable. The Veterans Gala at my home had been a tradition since I first bought the old colonial mansion decades ago. It had started small, just a few men from my original company, their wives and sons, and some old friends from the American Legion. Over the years, it had grown into a citywide event. Local press, dignitaries, philanthropists, and military brass mingled in the candlelit ballroom, sharing stories, honoring the fallen, raising money for scholarships and care packages. This year, it would be my last as host, and I was determined to make it count. I worked with my trusted staff men and women who'd served beside me, who knew the difference between protocol and posturing. Every invitation was handwritten, every speech rehearsed. But one thing was different this year. Not a single invitation went to Anna, her husband, or anyone connected to that new side of the family. I made no mention of the drama to the press, but everyone in town knew who was not on the guest list. The phones rang at the local radio station, speculating. The society pages wondered aloud. Some even called the omission cruel. I remained silent. Let them guess. Let them fill in the blanks as they liked. The night of the gala, the house was a living monument to loyalty and sacrifice. The driveway filled with vintage cars, the garden sparkled with lanterns, and inside, the air hummed with laughter and the deep, resonant voice of men who had faced real fear and real loss. I greeted each guest at the door in full dress uniform, stars on my shoulders, medals gleaming beneath the soft light. My handshake was steady, my voice proud, but never boastful. As dinner was served, I rose to speak, my words measured and deliberate, every phrase honed to a razor's edge. I spoke not of family by blood, but family by choice. I honored those who had shown courage in war and in peace, those who had answered the call to serve, those who understood the meaning of brotherhood, sacrifice, and loyalty. I spoke of the importance of honoring the past, of keeping promises, and of never abandoning those who had built the foundations of our lives. I thanked my comrades, my oldest friends, and the new generation of veterans whose eyes shone with the same conviction that once defined my own. At no point did I speak Anna's name. I did not acknowledge the empty seats where she and her in-laws once sat. I did not mention the betrayal or the humiliation, nor did I dwell on the personal cost of standing alone. Instead, I let my actions speak for themselves. The press snapped photos, the guests whispered, and everyone who mattered saw the truth. Legacy is not measured by bloodline, but by honor and memory. By the time dessert was served, the city's social hierarchy had been rewritten. The people who filled my house that night, some in wheelchairs, some with medals pinned to civilian jackets, some with weathered hands gripping canes, were the ones who truly deserved a place at my table. Outside, the town's lights glittered, and the distant sound of laughter drifted in through the windows, untouched by gossip or scandal. Anna watched from the gate, desperate for even a glimpse of welcome, but she remained on the outside, looking in, as it should have been all along. The world she tried to build on borrowed honor had collapsed. In its place stood a legacy no betrayal could erase, celebrated not in secret, but in the brightest light of dignity, service, and respect. The morning after the gala, the town was still buzzing. Local newspapers featured photographs of the veterans lined up proudly in my hall, with my uniform and medals front and center. There was a palpable shift in the air, sense that the true lines of respect and belonging had been drawn in a place no one could erase. For years, Anna and her new family had wielded my name for clout, trading on my reputation for their own gain, moving through life as if the weight of my history was theirs to spend. Now they found doors closed, friendships fraying, and reputations unraveling with every whispered story. But one thing remained unfinished, a conversation I knew Anna would eventually demand. It happened sooner than I expected. Late one afternoon, as I returned from a meeting at the Legion, I found her waiting on the porch. Gone was the carefully curated image, the tailored dresses, the practiced smiles, the air of superiority. In their place stood a woman exhausted by consequences, fighting the storm she herself had unleashed. For a moment she hesitated, as if unsure whether to speak or flee. I let the silence stretch between us, measured and cold as marble. Finally Anna spoke, her voice trembling beneath its bravado. "Dad, please, I just want to talk." I nodded once, but did not offer her a seat or invite her in. We stood on the steps, framed by the flag and the fading light, every inch of distance between us earned and necessary. She tried to apologize, at first with excuses, then with justifications. She spoke of pressures, misunderstandings, how things had gotten out of hand, how the world didn't understand her side of the story. Her words were a tangle of self-pity and half-baked regrets, circling the core but never truly admitting the root of the betrayal. I watched her, not with anger, but with the icy clarity of a man who had survived far worse than family treachery. When she finished, I simply said her name once, softly, like the echo of a bugle at dusk. "You left me in a place for the dying, Anna. You used what I built to chase comfort, while you and your new family paraded through my legacy as if it were your own. You thought I would always be there to save you, to forgive you. But even a general knows when a campaign is lost." Her eyes filled, but I held my ground, keeping the moment rigid and formal, letting her know that the intimacy of forgiveness was not something she could claim anymore. She reached out, a child's reflex, not a woman's repentance, but I stepped back. The gesture was not angry, only final. "I have survived wars," I said quietly. "I have lost brothers in arms. I have faced down enemies who did not flinch at death. But nothing wounded me as much as seeing my own blood treat me as an obstacle to their pleasure." Anna tried to argue, to plead, but each word fell flat against the wall I had built, one stone at a time, with every betrayal and every selfish choice. Finally, I told her what needed to be said. From this day forward, you have no claim to my name, my home, or my legacy. The doors you walked through on borrowed valor are closed. Go build your own life, if you have the strength. But do not look for me when it collapses. I will not be waiting. She stood frozen, tears staining her cheeks, her figure shrinking in the lengthening shadow. As she left, the sky over the house was streaked with gold, silent and indifferent, either of us. Inside, the house felt lighter than it had in years. The confrontation had not brought reconciliation, only certainty, the certainty that dignity is worth defending, even at the cost of family. That evening, I wrote in my journal, the same one I'd kept since my days as a cadet. I marked the date not as an end, but as a new beginning. The story of a man who refused to be discarded, who showed the world that even when abandoned, the bonds of brotherhood, service, and honor can never be broken by blood alone. The house was silent the next morning, the kind of quiet that feels earned, not empty. I rose early, as I always had, body and mind disciplined by decades of routines that began long before sunrise. I brewed my coffee and sat by the window, overlooking the flag on my front lawn, watching it move in the gentle breeze. There was nothing left to reclaim or defend within these walls. No more ghosts of laughter at the dinner table. No more echo of footsteps waiting for someone to come home. I had survived my war, and now I was simply at peace with the silence. But the world outside still watched. The whispers and headlines, the messages from veterans, neighbors, and even strangers who'd heard about my story. There was a hunger for closure, for a sense that what I'd done, what I'd suffered, meant something beyond one family's destruction. So I wrote my last address, not as a plea, nor as a lesson, but as a statement of truth. The words flowed with the steadiness of a man who had nothing left to fear and nothing left to lose. To those who watched from the sidelines, who judged from a distance, and to every soul who has ever built a legacy, only to see it betrayed by their own blood, I speak now for you. Honor is not a word. It is a burden carried in silence, measured in scars unseen and sacrifices unacknowledged. I wore the uniform for my country, not for applause. I served for the men and women beside me, not for parades or plaques or false praise. But I believed, perhaps too long, that loyalty and respect were owed by birthright. I see now that dignity must be guarded, even from those we love. I signed my name Major General William Henry Abrams, United States Army, retired, and delivered the letter to the local newspaper and posted it on the community board where so many of my neighbors, young and old, had gathered in the days since the story broke. I did not mention names or details. I did not drag my daughter's shame any further than she already had done herself. My words were for those who still needed permission to fight for themselves, to refuse to be erased, to remember that a lifetime of service could not be undone by one act of betrayal, no matter how cruel. The response was overwhelming. Messages arrived from old friends, distant relatives, and complete strangers, men and women, who had walked through their own deserts of abandonment, who saw in my words the reflection of their own silent battles. Veterans from across the state sent their thanks and respect. Neighbors brought handshakes, quiet nods, and sometimes just the simple dignity of listening. I was no longer just a story of abandonment, but a symbol that you could be rejected and still remain whole, that you could lose a family and gain a community. In the weeks that followed, the house never felt empty. The halls filled with the sounds of new friends, of comrades in arms, and of a legacy that had finally found its true home, not in bloodlines, but in those who understood what it meant to serve and to endure. And so, as I stood at the local Veterans Memorial to deliver a few final words at a ceremony attended by more faces than I'd seen in years, I spoke not about bitterness or vengeance, but about the courage it takes to reclaim your story. We are more than what is done to us. We are the sum of every time we stood up when the world tried to make us invisible. And if you are listening now, and you feel discarded or forgotten, stand tall. You are not alone. Your dignity cannot be taken, not by silence, not by betrayal, not by the passing of years. The applause that followed was not loud, but it was sincere, and I let it wash over me like a benediction. I left the podium that day, knowing I would never need to speak again about the wound my family had carved. My name, my rank, my story, these would not be defined by anyone's neglect, but carried forward in the strength I'd chosen in the end. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free, and in that freedom, I became more than a title or a memory. I became the example I had always hoped to be.